So today we'd like to honor our moms. We'd like to honor really all women. And so today I'd like to speak on the Exodus story, probably from a different perspective than you've ever heard before. The title of this message is The Women Who Made the Exodus Possible. So what I'd like to ask you to do is open up your Bibles, if you have them, to Exodus chapter 1, and we're going to be reading there in just a moment. So I think probably all of us are familiar with the Exodus story, how the people of Israel escaped slavery in Egypt. Typically, when we look at this story, we're looking at it from the perspective of Moses as the leader. But today I'd like to look at 7 important women who actually made that whole story possible. And without these women, there would not have been a Moses to lead anyone. So if you remember the setting for the story, Joseph had been sold as a slave in Egypt, and he interpreted Pharaoh's dream, and he was actually taken from prison and made the leader of all of Egypt so that he could store up grain for the coming famine. And during the famine that did come, Joseph's entire family, his father, all of his brothers and their families, they wound up coming to the land of Egypt to live. Pharaoh gave them property in the region of Goshen where they could raise their sheep. And so the people lived there in Egypt, the entire family of Israel. So we're going to begin reading in Exodus chapter 1. I'm reading from the New Living Translation. And what we're going to do, we're just going to read a couple verses at a time as we go through this. But starting in verse number 6, it says that, "In time, Joseph and all of his brothers died, ending that entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, they had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and they filled the land." So Joseph's family, they multiplied, they became strong. The original language reads such that their descendants, they swarmed. And that actually reminds us of the creation account when God created the fish in the sea. They swarmed in the sea. Some translations say that they teemed with life, and so the idea is this abundant life. The descendants of Israel, they multiplied, and they were living an abundant life in Egypt. Which kind of reminds me a little bit, we had all these families up here with all these kids. That's what abundant life looks like. Just life and activity and sounds and abundant life. So as the years pass, though, a new king, a new Pharaoh comes to power. He didn't know who Joseph was, and when he looked at the Israelites, he saw how strong they had become as a nation, and he was concerned that if an enemy nation ever came and invaded Egypt, he was afraid that the people of Israel might join forces with the invaders. And so he devised a plan to try to subdue the Israelites, or the Hebrew people. So picking up in verse 11, it says, "So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king." So we have this picture in Egypt. We have the people of God flourishing with abundant life. And then we have Pharaoh, who is kind of like the serpent in the garden. He's seeking to oppress that life. Pharaoh was directly opposed to God. And this makes sense because the people of Egypt, they had many gods. They worshiped the fallen angels who opposed gods. And Pharaoh believed himself to be a god. Picking up in verse 12, we see what happened. "But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and to do all of the work in the fields. They were ruthless in their demands. So Pharaoh's plan wasn't really working. He wanted to make the people slaves. He wanted to try to crush them that way, but it didn't work, so he came up with another plan. In verse 15, then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. All right, so we see these two women, Shiphrah and Puah, midwives, and they choose to disobey Pharaoh. Now, for some reason, Pharaoh didn't see the girls as a threat. He was only afraid of the boys. And this is probably because he was afraid of the men of Israel joining an invading army and fighting against Egypt. So he wasn't concerned with the girls. He just wanted the boys killed. But these midwives, they let the boys live. And so Pharaoh, he was upset. He called them before him and he demanded an answer. And so here's how the midwives replied in verse 19. The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, the midwives replied. They are more vigorous and they have their babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time. So think about it. Had these women actually obeyed Pharaoh, Moses would have been killed at birth. But because Shiphrah and Puah, they feared God, they defied Pharaoh. They let the boys live, and when Pharaoh questioned them, they stood up to Pharaoh. They did not back down. So again, Pharaoh, his plan's not working. He tries again. In verse 22, then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live. So he is determined to kill the boys, and so now we see the next woman in our story. It's Moses' mother. Exodus 2, verse 2, talking about Moses' mother, the woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. Okay, so this says that she saw he was a special baby. Some translations use the word beautiful. The original word is good, like at creation, when God looked at the things he created and said it was good. In the same way, Moses' mother looked at her baby and she saw that he was good. She recognized God's goodness in her baby and she chose to disobey the king. Rather than throw him in the river, she kept him hidden as long as it was possible so that no one else would throw him into the river. Picking up in chapter 2, verse 3. When she could hide him no longer, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. So this translation uses the word basket, but the original translation uses the word ark, like where we get Noah's Ark. So Moses' mother didn't just throw the baby into the water to drown. She made an ark. She coated it with pitch, put a lid on it, kind of like the ark that Noah built. So Moses' mother, she carefully put her baby in the ark and then placed him in the river. So had Moses' mother obeyed Pharaoh, obviously Moses, he would have died very shortly after birth. Again, there would have been no Exodus. But Moses' mother, when she looked at her son, she saw the good in him. She saw that he was good, and she chose to defy the king, and she refused to kill her baby in the river. And when she couldn't hide him any longer, she put him in an ark, and she trusted God for his survival. So Moses is in the river, and now we see the fourth woman, Miriam, Moses' older sister. Miriam stood by, and she watched to see what would happen. Now, Miriam would have been just a young girl at this point. She would have been maybe 5 or 6 years old. And she watched as Moses was in that basket, and she watched as Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, and her servants came to the river. And when the princess saw the basket, she sent a servant to bring it to her. Now we're going to see the fifth and sixth woman who play a part here in the story. Picking up Exodus chapter 2, verse 6. When the princess opened the basket, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then the baby's sister, Miriam, approached the princess. "Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. "Yes, do," the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. "Take this baby and nurse him for me," the princess told the baby's mother. "I will pay you for your help." So the woman took her baby home and nursed him. Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, "I lifted him out of the water." Okay, so we have the next two women in the story, Pharaoh's own daughter and her servant. This is interesting. The princess, she recognized the baby as a Hebrew, and she chose to rescue him. And Miriam, she was right there watching. She offered to bring a woman to nurse the baby. Of course, Miriam brings the baby's own mother, and Pharaoh's daughter paid her to nurse her own son. So we see a striking difference between Pharaoh and his own daughter. See, Pharaoh, in this story, it's like he's the personification of evil and death. He oppresses the people with slavery. He commanded that the boys be killed. Yet Pharaoh's own daughter, like the other women, defied Pharaoh. It's just so interesting to me. So the princess, her servant, they're members of Pharaoh's household, yet they had compassion on the children, and they were willing to defy Pharaoh's orders. And it's not like they just resisted him. They actually did the very opposite of what he was doing and what he was commanding. Pharaoh commanded the boys to be drowned. The princess took the baby out of the water, the opposite. Pharaoh made the Hebrews his slaves. The princess went and paid this Hebrew woman, the baby's own mother, to nurse her own baby. So we have quite a twist of events. So what winds up happening is, Moses goes home with his own mother. When he's old enough, his mother brings Moses to the princess, who adopts him as her own son. Pharaoh hated the Israelite people. He hated the boys, but yet Moses was adopted into Pharaoh's household. He was raised in the palace. He was clothed and fed and educated at Pharaoh's expense. To me, that's just really bizarre. The only reason that was even possible was because of the courage of all of these women to defy Pharaoh. So up until this point, we see 6 of the 7 women who have each played a part, a very important part, in rescuing Moses from death. So we're going to pick up now in Exodus chapter 2, verse 11. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. Okay, first thing we see Moses do is he murders somebody. So far in the story, the women have all saved life, and it's been Pharaoh who's been taking life. The first thing Moses does is he acts like Pharaoh and he kills a person. Now, this murder was not a secret. Pharaoh, he finds out about it. He tries to kill Moses. And so what does Moses do? He ran away. He escaped into the desert to the land of the Midianites, which is present-day Saudi Arabia. And Moses, he stayed there with a family of shepherds, and he winds up marrying a woman named Zipporah, or Zephora. So Moses, he had been raised as Egyptian royalty. Again, this is interesting. The Egyptians really did not like shepherds. They despised them. We know this from the story of Joseph. The Egyptians couldn't stand to be in the same room with shepherds, yet here is Moses, an Egyptian prince, now living with shepherds, and he becomes a shepherd himself. In fact, he remains in the desert for 40 years caring for sheep. And it's after those many years of watching sheep, caring for sheep, that he comes and he speaks to Moses out of the burning bush. God told Moses, Moses, the king who wanted to kill you, he is now dead. And God was going to send Moses back to Egypt to bring his people out of slavery. Moses' response to God was less than courageous. Exodus 3:11. But Moses protested to God, "Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt?" Then in verse 13, but Moses again pleaded, "Lord, please send anyone else." Then the Lord became angry with Moses. And that's a significant contrast in the behavior of Moses when you look at the women in the story who were not afraid of Pharaoh. Unlike the women, it looks like Moses doesn't fear God, at least not at first. Moses, he was afraid of Pharaoh. He was slow to obey God. And it appears that he's not willing or ready to stand up to Pharaoh at all. But after a while, God convinced Moses to return to Egypt. And so Moses, he went to his father-in-law and explained the news, and then he packs up the family donkey, and they begin the journey to Egypt. So picking up now in Exodus 4, verse 24. On the way to Egypt, at a place where Moses and his family had stopped for the night, the Lord confronted him and was about to kill him. But Moses' wife, Zipporah, took a flint knife and circumcised her son. She touched his feet with the foreskin and said, "Now you are a bridegroom of blood to me." After that, the Lord left him alone. Does that seem a bit bizarre? Yes, it does. Let me try to explain this a little bit. It's not clearly stated, but what it looks like is happening is Moses is about to die for his disobedience. Moses had not circumcised his son. Circumcision was a covenant, a sign of the covenant that Abraham had made with God, and it was something that all of the Israelites were to do. On the 8th day after a baby boy was born, it was to be circumcised. We know that Moses was circumcised because his mother kept him hidden till he was 3 months old. He had to have been circumcised. That's what they did. But for whatever reason, Moses had not obeyed. He had not circumcised his own son. But apparently, Zipporah knew that this was required. So she stepped in and she circumcised their son, and she touched Moses' feet with the foreskin, and God relented. If this isn't odd enough already, it's going to get a little bit more interesting. In the Bible, sometimes when you see the word feet, this is a euphemism for the male private parts. Why? I don't really know, but it just is. If you remember the story of Ruth and Naomi, Ruth told her daughter-in-law, "Okay, this is how you're going to get Boaz to take notice of you." So Ruth told Naomi, "Look, it's harvest season. Boaz and his servants, they're going to sleep where they thresh the wheat. When they're sleeping, go and lie down next to Boaz and uncover his feet." So Naomi did just that. The next day, Boaz took care of all of the arrangements to marry Naomi. That's different. Okay, but that's what they did apparently. They would uncover the feet, and that, I don't know why. Okay, Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah described the seraphim angels that he saw around the Lord's throne. Attending him were mighty seraphim, each having 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces. With 2 wings they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. I'm not a biblical scholar, but scholars will tell you. In some instances in the Bible, the word feet does not refer to those things with toes, but rather refer to the male private parts. Back to our story. So Zipporah did what Moses failed to do. She circumcised their son. She touched Moses' feet with the foreskin. Again, I don't quite understand why all this happened, but we see that Zipporah, because of her obedience, she again saves Moses' life. 7 different women now who are all very key in saving the life of Moses, who is to lead the people out of Egypt. And this is interesting. I don't know if you caught this. Moses' wife name, Zipporah. It is the same name, though spelled and maybe pronounced a little bit differently, of the midwife at the beginning of the story who defied Pharaoh. Spellings are a little different, but the meanings of the name are exactly the same. Okay, I hope this is coming together, but what I want you to notice is the women in this story. Moses was an amazing man, and I think we would all agree with that, and I don't want to discredit him in any way. But I want you to recognize that Moses, he had his weaknesses, and they're pretty apparent. He was a murderer. He was slow to obey God. He was afraid to confront Pharaoh. He needed time to develop as a leader. He needed time to learn to fear God, and he needed time to learn to trust God. You know, God did work through Moses to rescue the people of Israel from Egypt, but that never would have happened if it was not for those 7 women. Those women, they feared God, and they had courage, and they were very quick to obey. Are you seeing that? Okay. Jesus said, "The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I come that they may have life and have it abundantly." So we see that killing, we see that destruction very clearly in Pharaoh. We see that abundant life, and we see how the women fear God, they are courageous, and they were very willing to defy Pharaoh to protect that life. Women protect and they nurture life. I believe women foster the abundant life of God. So just a few things out of this story. I believe women nurture the abundant life that God has blessed us with. We see this clearly in our children and in our families. Women are powerful against the enemy, protecting their children and their family from the enemy. Think mama bear. You don't want to get between a mama bear and her cubs, right? And we see that in these women who were not afraid to defy Pharaoh even to his face, to protect Moses, to protect the other baby boys. Our world is full of pharaohs, a lot of evil influences that are out to steal, kill, and destroy. And really, we can be thankful for women. We can be thankful for mothers who are courageous to protect their families. Women are courageous. They are not afraid to defy evil. Women are quick to obey. Though we see in Moses that he was afraid and actually very slow to obey, the women in this story did not hesitate. Even Miriam, who was only 5 years old, was not afraid. I'm not sure how many, but I believe we have probably a number of men in this room who probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the women in your life. You know, women, they encourage us in our relationship with God. And I think some of us probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the women in our lives. So I believe God, he works through both men and he works through women, and he works really well through them together. And without the women in this story, there would not have been an Exodus story. Or if there was, it would have looked completely different because Moses would not have been a part of that story. Now I think, when we read this, the stories of these women and how they are involved, it can actually be easy to miss. It's really easy just to focus on the bigger picture of Moses and the people coming out of Egypt. Yet it's really important to recognize the actions of these women and how they led to Moses' survival and being able to actually do the things that God called him to do. So it's the courage and the obedience of these women that actually made the Exodus story possible. I think oftentimes, I know, a lot of times mothers are at work behind the scenes. Moms, the things that you do are very, very important. You shape the lives of your children and your families, your husband. your actions have a tremendous impact on the future, on future generations, though you may not actually know the results of your obedience until much later. In fact, we may not know until we get to heaven. I wonder how much the women in this story were aware of what their actions led to. Women are powerful. I've seen this over and over. And I'm going to share some things. And I'm not saying this to discredit men. I'm not. When we were on the mission field, most of the missionaries that we interacted with were women. There are actually a lot of single women on the mission field. There were men there, but most that we interacted with were women. This was especially true in the Middle East. When I consider our own church, if we look at those who are serving on the Dream Team, the majority are women. It's actually pretty close, but the majority are women. When we consider our Connect Up prayer team, I think we're probably more than 90% women. When I think about the Freedom Conference we had in here yesterday, I think more than 2/3 of those who came and participated in that were women. And I'm not putting men down. That's not what I'm trying to do. But what I'm trying to do is simply point out that women tend to be very quick to obey. Women fear God. Women are courageous. Obviously, that's not true of all women. I don't mean to just paint a blanket, but this is just kind of what we see. And it's women who are often the ones who help us men grow in our relationship with God. So what I would like to do is just honor women today for who you are and what you do. Just honor you for your quick obedience and your courage in the face of evil, your courage to protect your children and your families, because what you do is you save lives. And I would especially like to honor just the mothers who are here with us today. And I'd like to ask, even if we could just have all the moms stand up. If you're a mom, if you would please just stand. I'd like to pray just a blessing over you.